The modern debt ceiling was never intended as a fiscal constraint. It began in 1917 as a wartime borrowing authorization, a technical mechanism to finance a global conflict. Over a century later, this administrative tool has transformed into a $38.5 trillion political trap, revealing how financial systems evolve from practical solutions into structural vulnerabilities. The Wartime Authorization. The year was 1917. The United States had entered the Great War. This required unprecedented government spending. Congress faced a practical problem. They needed to authorize borrowing quickly. The existing system required separate approval for each bond issue. This was too slow for wartime needs. The Second Liberty Bond Act solved this. It granted the Treasury Secretary authority to borrow. There was an aggregate limit of $15 billion. This was not a fiscal constraint. It was an administrative convenience. The mechanics were straightforward. Congress approved a total borrowing capacity. The Treasury could issue bonds within that limit. They did not need to return to Congress each time. This made sense during wartime. Speed mattered more than detailed oversight. The institutional friction was reduced. Government could respond to military needs faster. Bond sales could be timed to market conditions. This flexibility was crucial. The human consequence was subtle. For ordinary citizens buying Liberty bonds, the system seemed efficient. They received certificates promising repayment with interest. The government appeared organized and capable. Trust in war financing grew. This borrowing authority worked so well that it continued after the war. The limit was raised periodically. Each increase followed the same logic. Congress wanted to maintain Treasury flexibility. They also wanted to retain some oversight. The aggregate limit served both purposes. It allowed borrowing while maintaining congressional authority. This balance seemed reasonable. The system functioned for decades. Through the 1920s and 30s, the debt limit was adjusted. Each change was technical, not political. The numbers grew, but the principle remained. Congress authorized a ceiling. Treasury operated below it. When approaching the limit, Congress raised it. This became routine. The original wartime purpose faded. The mechanism remained. By 1939, the debt ceiling stood at $45 billion. This was 3 times the original limit. Yet the process remained administrative. There were no political crises, no brinkmanship over raising the limit. The system worked as intended. It provided flexibility with oversight. This was the economic order, a technical mechanism for government borrowing, simple, functional, and largely invisible to the public. The debt ceiling was not controversial. It was not debated in political campaigns. It was a routine part of government finance. Treasury officials managed borrowing within the limit. Congressional committees reviewed the numbers periodically. The public focused on other matters. This stability would not last forever, but for several decades, the system functioned smoothly. The original wartime authorization had become permanent. Yet its purpose had shifted from emergency war financing to routine government operations. This transition happened gradually. No one questioned the underlying logic. The debt ceiling seemed like a sensible check, a way to control government borrowing. In reality, it was never designed for that purpose. This misunderstanding would have consequences later, but for now the system appeared stable. Government could borrow as needed. Congress maintained oversight. The public trusted the arrangement. This was the foundation, a technical mechanism born in wartime, adapted for peacetime governance, seemingly functional but built on a misunderstanding of its original purpose. The post-war transformation. The Second World War changed everything. Government spending exploded. The debt ceiling had to be raised dramatically, from $45 billion in 1939 to $300 billion by 1945. This was a 6-fold increase. The mechanics remained the same. Congress authorized higher limits. Treasury issued bonds, but the scale transformed the system. War bonds were sold to millions of Americans. This created a new political reality. Government debt became personal. Families held war bonds in their homes. They expected repayment. The institutional friction increased. Managing $300 billion in debt required new systems. The Federal Reserve helped manage bond markets. Interest payments became a significant budget item. The human consequence was profound. Ordinary citizens became creditors to their government. This created a psychological bond. People felt invested in national finances. They expected responsible management. After the war, the debt did not disappear. It stabilized around $250 billion. The economy grew rapidly. Debt as percentage of GDP fell. This masked underlying tensions. The debt ceiling remained. It was raised periodically, but the context had changed. No longer a wartime emergency tool, now a permanent feature of peacetime finance. The 1950s saw economic expansion. Tax revenues grew. Budget deficits were rare. The debt ceiling seemed less relevant. It was raised only a few times. Each increase was routine. Congressional debates were brief. The public paid little attention. This changed in the 1960s. The Vietnam War and Great Society programs increased spending. Deficits returned. The debt ceiling became more active. It was raised more frequently. The numbers grew larger. Yet the process remained mostly technical. Then came the 1970s. Stagflation created new pressures. High inflation eroded the real value of debt, but it also increased nominal borrowing needs. The debt ceiling kept climbing, from $300 billion in 1965 to $900 billion by 1980. This tripling in 15 years changed the dynamics. The institutional friction became more visible. Treasury had to manage cash flow more carefully. Approaching the debt ceiling created operational challenges. They developed extraordinary measures. These were accounting techniques to stay under the limit. The human consequence shifted. Bondholders now included foreign governments and institutions. The personal connection of war bonds faded. Debt became an abstract financial instrument. Public understanding diminished. Meanwhile, political attitudes were changing. Some lawmakers began viewing the debt ceiling differently, no longer as a technical authorization, instead as a leverage point, a way to force fiscal discipline. This was a fundamental misunderstanding. The debt ceiling controls borrowing to pay for already authorized spending. It does not control the spending itself. This distinction would become crucial, but in the 1980s, this nuance was overlooked. The Reagan tax cuts and defense buildup created large deficits. The debt ceiling had to be raised 18 times during that decade. Each increase became more contentious. The numbers reached $1 trillion, then $2 trillion, then $3 trillion. The scale was unprecedented. The original $15 billion limit seemed quaint. The system was straining, yet the basic mechanics remained unchanged. Congress authorized spending. Taxes did not cover it. Treasury borrowed the difference. When approaching the debt limit, Congress raised it. This dance continued, but the music was changing. Political polarization increased. The routine became contentious. The debt ceiling transformed from administrative tool to political weapon. This shift happened gradually. No single event marked the change. Rather, a series of small confrontations, each raising the stakes slightly. The institutional friction was no longer just operational. It became political. Treasury officials worried about market reactions. Bond traders watched congressional debates. The human consequence was anxiety. Uncertainty about government payments affected planning. Businesses hesitated to invest. The system designed for wartime efficiency was now creating peacetime uncertainty. This was the growing strain, a technical mechanism burdened by scale and politics. The original purpose forgotten, new meanings attached. The debt ceiling was becoming something its creators never intended, a point of potential crisis rather than administrative convenience. The political weaponization. The 1990s marked a turning point. The debt ceiling reached $4.9 trillion. Political battles intensified. The mechanics remained technically simple. Congress must raise the limit to authorize borrowing, but the process became entangled with budget debates. Lawmakers realized they could demand concessions, and their cave, threatening not to raise the ceiling, gave them leverage. This was the institutional friction becoming political strategy. The human consequence was confusion. Most citizens did not understand the debt ceiling's purpose. They heard about potential government shutdowns. They worried about Social Security payments. The abstraction of government finance became personal anxiety. In 1995, a major confrontation occurred. The government actually shut down briefly. This was a warning sign. The debt ceiling debate had caused real disruption, yet the pattern continued. Each time the limit needed raising, there was drama. Last-minute negotiations, temporary extensions. The system was no longer functioning smoothly. The original efficiency was gone, replaced by brinkmanship. The early 2000s brought more strain. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq increased spending. Tax cuts reduced revenue. Deficits grew larger. The debt ceiling climbed past $6 trillion, then $8 trillion, then $10 trillion. The numbers became difficult to comprehend. Ordinary people could not grasp what $10 trillion meant. It was an abstraction, yet the consequences were real. Each debt ceiling increase required political capital. The process consumed legislative time and energy. The institutional friction had concrete costs. Government operations were disrupted. Planning became difficult. Treasury officials developed more sophisticated, extraordinary measures. These were accounting maneuvers to create borrowing room. They included suspending investments in government retirement funds, delaying payments to certain accounts. These techniques bought time, but they were temporary solutions. They did not address the underlying issue. The human consequence was eroding trust. Each debt ceiling crisis made the government seem dysfunctional. Bond markets reacted nervously. Interest rates reflected uncertainty. The cost of government borrowing increased slightly during these periods. This was a real economic cost, paid by taxpayers, all for a mechanism that served no substantive purpose. The debt ceiling did not control spending. Spending was authorized separately. It did not control deficits. Those resulted from tax and spending decisions. The debt ceiling only controlled the government's ability to pay bills already incurred. This made the confrontations particularly irrational. Lawmakers were threatening default on obligations they had already approved. The mechanics of this were clear to economists, but politically, the distinction was blurred. The public saw debt ceiling debates as debates about debt. In reality, they were debates about payment authority. This misunderstanding fueled the political utility. Threatening the debt ceiling sounded like threatening to control debt. In reality, it was threatening to not pay bills. This semantic confusion had real consequences. By 2011, the debt ceiling reached $14.3 trillion. A major crisis unfolded. Credit rating agencies warned of downgrades. Financial markets grew anxious. The government came within days of missing payments. A last-minute deal avoided disaster. But the damage was done. Standard & Poor's downgraded U.S. debt from AAA to AA+. This was historic. The United States had lost its top credit rating. The human consequence was widespread. Retirement accounts lost value. Mortgage rates were affected. Economic uncertainty increased. The institutional friction had become systemic risk. The debt ceiling was no longer just a political tool. It was a threat to financial stability. This transformation was complete. What began as a wartime efficiency measure had become a source of peacetime instability. The system was working against its original purpose. Yet the pattern continued. More crises followed. Each time the limit needed raising. Each time there was brinkmanship. The numbers kept growing: 15 trillion, 18 trillion, 20 trillion. The scale was staggering. The original 15 billion limit was 1,000th of 1% of current levels. The system had scaled beyond recognition, yet the basic mechanics remained. Congress must authorize borrowing. Failure to do so would mean default. This simple fact created recurring crises. The adaptation had failed. Reforms were proposed but not implemented. The system continued on its dangerous path, the 38 trillion threshold. By the mid-2020s, the debt ceiling reached $31.4 trillion. Then it kept climbing. Extraordinary measures became routine. Treasury officials managed cash flow with precision. They delayed payments, suspended investments, created temporary borrowing room. These techniques were well honed, but they were finite. Each debt ceiling crisis followed a familiar pattern. Warning from the Treasury Secretary. Extraordinary measures activated. Negotiations in Congress. Last-minute deal. Limit raised. This dance happened repeatedly. The institutional friction was now built into government operations. Planning assumed periodic crises. Budget analysts accounted for uncertainty premiums. The human consequence was normalization. Each crisis seemed less alarming than the last. The public grew accustomed to brinkmanship. This was dangerous complacency. The numbers reached 34 trillion, then 36 trillion. Each increase followed political drama. The substance remained the same. Congress authorizing payment for spending it already approved. The absurdity was apparent to experts. Yet the system persisted. Then came the 38.5 trillion threshold. This number represented decades of accumulated decisions, tax policies, spending programs, economic cycles, wars, recessions, pandemics, all reflected in one number. The mechanics of reaching this level were straightforward. Deficits each year added to the total. Interest on existing debt compounded. The institutional friction at this scale was profound. Managing 38.5 trillion in debt required sophisticated systems. Payment processing, bond auctions, investor relations, all operated under the shadow of the debt ceiling. The human consequence was abstraction. Few could comprehend $38.5 trillion. It was roughly $120,000 per American, or 160% of annual economic output. These ratios mattered to economists, but to ordinary people they were just large numbers. And Trust in the system was declining. Polls showed growing concern about national debt, but understanding remained low. Most people did not distinguish between the debt ceiling and debt itself. This confusion made political manipulation easier. Lawmakers could rail against the debt ceiling while having voted for the spending that created the debt. The cognitive dissonance was systemic. By this point, the debt ceiling served no useful purpose. It did not constrain spending. It did not promote fiscal responsibility. It only created periodic crises. Yet eliminating it seemed politically impossible. The institutional inertia was too strong. The system continued. Each crisis followed the same script, but the risks were accumulating. Financial markets had adapted. They expected last-minute resolutions. This created moral hazard. Lawmakers could engage in brinkmanship knowing markets expected a deal. This expectation made crises more likely, not less. The human consequence was risk normalization. People assumed the government would always find a way. This assumption was dangerous. History showed that assumptions could be wrong. Other countries had defaulted on their debt, usually during political crises. The United States was not immune. The debt ceiling created a unique vulnerability. No other country had such a mechanism. Most parliamentary systems authorized borrowing as part of the budget process. The U.S. system was unusual. This uniqueness created special risks. The 38.5 trillion threshold represented more than just a number. It represented the accumulation of all previous decisions and the continuation of a flawed system. The loss of trust was gradual but real. Each crisis eroded confidence slightly. The question was not if another crisis would occur, but when, and whether this time would be different, whether assumptions would prove wrong, whether the dance would stumble. This uncertainty hung over the system. A technical mechanism turned political weapon, operating at unprecedented scale, with consequences few fully understood. Structural inevitability. The debt ceiling could not continue indefinitely in its current form. The mathematics were clear. Government spending exceeded revenue. This created deficits. Deficits required borrowing. Borrowing increased debt. When debt reached the ceiling, borrowing had to stop. But stopping borrowing meant not paying bills. This was not sustainable. The institutional friction had reached breaking point. Treasury's extraordinary measures could only buy limited time, usually a few months. After that, payments would be missed. This was the structural reality. The human consequence would be immediate. Social Security recipients might not get checks. Government contractors might not be paid. Interest on Treasury bonds might not be paid. This last point was crucial. Defaulting on bond payments would trigger financial crisis. The mechanics of this were well understood by economists. U.S. Treasury bonds were considered risk-free assets. They underpinned the global financial system. Banks held them as capital. Central banks held them as reserves. Money market funds invested in them. A default would shatter this foundation. Interest rates would spike. Credit markets would freeze. The economic damage would be severe. This was why debt ceiling crises always resolve at the last minute. The consequences of not resolving were too terrible to contemplate. Yet this created a dangerous pattern. Each successful resolution reinforced the behavior. Lawmakers could engage in brinkmanship knowing disaster would be avoided. This was the trap. The system incentivized risky behavior because the alternative was unthinkable. The numbers made continuation impossible without change. 38.5 trillion in debt required constant refinancing. Maturities ranged from 1 month to 30 years. Each day, billions in bonds matured. New bonds had to be issued to pay them off. This rolling refinancing required continuous market access. A debt ceiling crisis threatened this access. If investors doubted the government's ability to pay, they might demand higher interest rates or refuse to buy bonds altogether. This could create a self-fulfilling crisis. The institutional friction would become systemic failure. The human consequence would affect everyone, not just bondholders, but anyone with a bank account, a retirement fund, a mortgage. The interconnectedness of modern finance meant default would ripple through the entire economy. History offered precedents. Other countries had defaulted. Argentina in 2001, Russia in 1998, Greece in 2012. Each caused severe economic pain, but the United States was different. Its debt was the foundation of global finance. A U.S. default would be unprecedented in scale. The system was designed to prevent this. Multiple safeguards existed. The Federal Reserve could act as lender of last resort, but there were limits to what the Fed could do. It could not authorize borrowing beyond the debt ceiling. It could only manage the consequences. The structural inevitability was clear. Either the debt ceiling mechanism would change, or eventually it would cause a crisis that could not be contained. The mathematics allowed no other outcome. Continuous deficits required continuous borrowing. A borrowing limit required periodic increases. Political brinkmanship around those increases created risk. Eventually, probability suggested the brinkmanship would go too far. The human consequence of that error would be catastrophic. This was a $38.5 trillion trap, a system created for wartime efficiency, transformed into a peacetime vulnerability, operating at unimaginable scale, with consequences too severe to risk, yet risked repeatedly. The break was inevitable, not necessarily a dramatic collapse, but a gradual recognition that the system no longer served its purpose, that it created risk without benefit, that reform was necessary. The question was timing. Would reform come before crisis or after? History suggested after. Most systemic changes followed crises, not preceded them. This pattern appeared likely to continue. The debt ceiling would remain until it caused sufficient damage to force change. This was the structural inevitability. A system destined for failure, not because of malicious intent, but because of misaligned incentives and misunderstood purposes. The original wartime authorization had evolved into something dangerous. Its continued existence threatened the stability it was meant to support. This irony was the heart of the trap. A mechanism created to ensure government could finance itself now threatened that financing. The mathematics were inexorable. The politics were stuck. The outcome was predictable. Change would come. The only question was how. Historical patterns of debt. Sovereign debt limits have appeared throughout history. Ancient Rome faced similar constraints. The Roman Republic had debt ceilings for provincial governors. They could only borrow specified amounts. This prevented excessive indebtedness, but also constrained necessary spending. The institutional friction slowed military responses. The human consequence was sometimes defeat in battle. Medieval kingdoms used different mechanisms. Monarchs borrowed from bankers, then defaulted when unable to repay. The Fugger banking family suffered such defaults. This pattern repeated across Europe. Kings borrowed for wars, then reneged on debts. The mechanics were simple: borrow, spend, default. The institutional friction destroyed banking families. The human consequence was financial ruin for lenders. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century developed a better system. They created permanent debt with regular interest payments. This built trust. Investors bought bonds willingly. The debt ceiling was implicit. Market confidence set the limit. When trust was high, borrowing was easy. When trust fell, borrowing became difficult. This system worked for centuries. The human consequence was economic prosperity. The Netherlands became Europe's financial center. The French monarchy faced debt crisis in the 1780s. Spending on wars and court luxury created massive debt. Tax systems were inefficient. Borrowing costs rose. Eventually, the king could not borrow more. This contributed to the French Revolution. As the institutional friction became political revolution, the human consequence was social upheaval. The British developed a different approach in the 19th century. They established the principle of parliamentary control over borrowing, but no fixed ceiling. Instead, annual budgets authorized necessary borrowing. This provided flexibility with oversight. The system proved durable. The human consequence was financial stability. Britain became the world's banker. These historical patterns reveal important insights. First, debt limits work best when flexible. Second, they fail when rigid. Third, political control over borrowing is necessary, but brinkmanship is dangerous. Fourth, trust matters more than legal limits. Fifth, systems evolve to meet circumstances. The U.S. debt ceiling represents a particular historical moment. Born in wartime 1917, adapted for peacetime, then weaponized for politics, now operating at unprecedented scale. The pattern is familiar. A practical solution becomes a structural problem. The historical insight is clear. Financial systems must evolve. They cannot remain static while circumstances change. The original debt ceiling made sense in 1917. It does not make sense today. The scale is different. The politics are different. The risks are different. Yet the mechanism remains. This disconnect creates vulnerability. Other countries have faced similar transitions. They adapted their systems. The United States has not. This is the historical lesson. Systems that do not adapt eventually fail. The $38.5 trillion trap is not unique. It is a variation on a historical theme. Sovereigns have always struggled with debt management. The solutions have varied. Some worked, some failed. The U.S. system is showing strain. History suggests it will change. The only questions are how and when. The pattern of 1929 and 2008 shows that financial systems can reach breaking points. They can appear stable until they are not. The debt ceiling represents such a point, appearing stable during normal times, but vulnerable during stress. This is the historical insight, not prediction, but pattern recognition. Systems have natural limits. They can be pushed beyond those limits for a time, but eventually reality reasserts itself. The mathematics of debt are relentless. Politics can delay but not eliminate them. This is the lesson of history, not just for the United States, but for all sovereign borrowers. Debt must be managed. Limits must be sensible. Systems must be adaptable. The alternative is crisis. This pattern has repeated for centuries. It will likely continue. The specific mechanisms will change, but the underlying dynamics will remain. Debt, trust, politics, and mathematics. These forces interact in predictable ways. Understanding this history provides perspective, not to predict the future, but to understand the present. The $38.5 trillion trap is a historical moment, part of a longer story about sovereign finance, a story that continues to unfold.